You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Betoota Advocate, on Desert Rock FM. Well, here we are on the Betoota Advocate radio show. We're on the road. We are joined today by an iconic Melbourneian and actually almost 20-year veteran of the Australian media as a commentator.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
John Safran, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you very much. I don't know whether you've got a curse, but I drive around Melbourne all the time and I'm just driving here and there and it's all in the city. And somehow when coming here, like the Google map took me to I had to go into these pothole, kind of looked like where Breaking Bad does the drug deals, and then there was fences that cut me off, and I had to go. So I don't know. I haven't seen this side of Melbourne before.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, this just looks like Melbourne to us, you know.
We're actually in a place called Kensington, I believe. It's an industrial area. And what you've just said, John, suggests you might live in a bubble?
Yes, correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about the bubble you grew up in? Did you grow up in a Jewish area?
You've got it all a bit sus. Yes.
Sorry. No, that wasn't an interrogation question.
I do live at the moment, and I semi-grew up here in a suburb called Balaclava, which is the real hub of ultra-Orthodox Jews.
Okay.
So if you want those extras in your life to give a bit of fun to your weekend where you're sitting having a coffee, and then the extras are just more interesting because they've got the ringlets and the big furry hats, Balaclava is where you go.
So visibly Jewish community.
Yeah, yes.
Which we weren't familiar if that kind of existed in Melbourne. We know it does exist in certain parts of Sydney, and Bob Catter would argue in certain parts of North Queensland. A lot of Semitic descendants, he says, up that way. But can you tell us a little bit what it was like growing up here like that, and if your upbringing as a Jewish man in Melbourne kind of led to you? Obviously, you're now known as the Jew detective. Do you reckon it's all part of your upbringing?
Yeah, I've always been a bit of an insider-outsider. Mm-hmm. So when I was really young, I just went to a regular primary school. And I lived outside of Balaclava in just a more regular area. Mm-hmm. And then I mucked around too much in Year 7 at my state high school. And so my parents said I had to go to a small, strict school. And they ended up sending me to this ultra-Orthodox, Jewish school where there were 14 kids in our class. And I was the least religious kid in the most religious school. And so their thinking was it was a bit like sending me to the nuns, who were going it's not just because you're sent to the nuns, suddenly it's because you're super Catholic or anything like that. And so then I was on the inside of this ultra-Orthodox Jewish school, but I was still just doing my own thing. I was obsessed with hip-hop. Growing up, way more. I wasn't really thinking all about religion or anything. And then when I got out of that particular bubble and started entering into TV land or whatever, you start telling stories and you start getting a vibe that, this is an interesting area that people don't know about. And I've had this, I've grown up with these interesting experiences. So you start using that as a bit of an anchor.
So you didn't go into this school and come out the other side as the boy that your parents were hoping would come out the other side. You had a bit of a thirst for things kind of outside.
Yeah, but even that was confusing because this school, because it was run by missionaries that were from New York. So a lot of...
They'd come to Melbourne.
Yeah, they'd come to Melbourne. And so... And so it was a bit of anarchy, really.
Yeah.
It was way less strict than my state high school that I'd gone to in Year 7.
I can imagine.
And there was a lot of screeching, and you're allowed to be a loudmouth in class. And it wasn't until I left that I realised I was so sarcastic because in the context of the school, I was just regular. Yeah. You know what I mean? There was a bit of a New York, because they all came from New York, missionary, so it was a little bit.
I'm walking here kind of.
Yeah. So it was a good kind of New York feeling, in the middle of Melbourne.
Yeah, because a lot of our listeners, particularly up in Queensland, aren't really familiar with the Jewish Australian upbringing, unless they're obviously familiar with your work. And a lot of people kind of would feel like it's a they would equate it to, say, Brethren or Methodist or something like that, just another type of white. But
yeah.
it is, you're right, you say that a bit, inside, outsider.
Yeah.
Do you sometimes feel like a bit of an undercover cop surrounded by white people and you hear, some of the comments they make?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The whole whiteness thing's kind of interesting because, like, in the wider community, like wider Australia, we're just like, there's some more white people or whatever. But you go into these pockets, whether it's the right, the hard right, the far right, the hard left, in some pockets of the Muslim community, in other pockets, and suddenly you're not just white. No. You're white plus. Yeah. Or rather, you're not simply white. You're sort of part of their story, and you're like a character in their story of how the world works, and often not a pleasant character. So it does become... That's what I found fascinating when I was doing my book, Depends What You Mean by Extremist, was really waking up to that. Because I already kind of had the vibe that if I hang around with neo-Nazis, they're going to be a bit dark on the Jews. So that wasn't a surprise, but I was quite stunned by like things on the hard left, and either things weren't thought through that well or they were overthought in a way that made the Jew like not a pleasant character.
How were you received? Because that book was obviously out just a couple of years ago, so you were quite well known before you wrote the book on extremism. How did those people on the right, how did they treat you when you first started to try and peer your way into their little bubble?
I was just incidentally like slightly one step ahead of this whole thing of like the alt-right growing and Pauline Hanson having her born-again moment. So when I was hanging out with them, I was happy to be like writing a book about hanging out with six skinheads in a pub. Yeah. And then it sort of like grew and grew and grew. And I guess they just didn't know what to do. Like, what are you going to do if you're holding a small protest on the street and then I come up there? You're just kind of going to go along with it, I guess. Yeah. Like it'd be quite a big thing to go and like thump someone in the face.
Yeah.
Although after the fact, someone told me he had to stop when I was up in, I think, Bendigo. This one member of the far right contacted me and said, "Oh, yeah, they're going to jump you at that rally," but I talked them out of it. But I don't know if that's true or not. And I was quite disappointed because that would have been quite a good chapter for the book. And obviously by now, a couple of years later, all the wounds would have been healed. Yeah. So thanks a lot, jerk.
So does that mean like these people knew who you were able to walk up to them and they were like, bugger off, John. Get out of here.
Well, I were part of a greater Jewish conspiracy when you in their minds.
So I just kind of hung out at the rallies. I was calling these rallies. So I just kind of hung out almost until they came to me. Yeah. So it was a bit like hanging out with kittens. If you like jump at a kitten, it runs off. But if you sort of hang around there. So I am comparing Australia's skinhead community to kittens in this particular metaphor.
Now, there looks like there's been waves, and you'd be the one who's documented this, but there's been waves of kind of white nationalism or neo-Nazism spiking in Australia. Obviously, there's the romper stomper era of Melbourne Vietnamese, and
it's almost always in Victoria though.
In that lull, I guess, between the 80s when there was that anti-Asian sentiment, 80s and 90s, and the skinheads, and the real kind of buying the special knives from Hitler and collectibles and that kind of stuff. And then there was this lull, and then we've seen it rear its head again with the internet. You were looking at these people in that lull, and it was kind of laughable. And did you find it funny at the time, or did you think that these people still had a bit of clout at that time?
Yeah, they always have a clout. They can always do a lot of harm, even if it's on a small scale level. So they can still like just beat up people on the street. So even if you don't get political about it, like because everyone's obsessed with structural things and stuff. Yeah. Even if you say these skinheads have no power whatsoever, they still like can really be.
They still have access to steroids and still get boots.
Total assholes who like commit violent crimes against people of different skin colour. So there's that. But then. And then it becomes a bit like how much, when they started rising up, they were energised a bit by things like, Pauline Hanson becoming big and then Trump becoming big. But even before that, the reason they kind of came out of the shadows again was because they figured out a way that they could present themselves as having mainstream concerns. So if you're there rabbiting on about even black people or the Jews or something. It's like, whatever. But then they kind of worked out this sort of more, this kind of Today Tonight version of what they did, where it's like on Today Tonight they'd be talking about halal certification or things like about terrorism or whatever. So they came out of the shadows and were basically kind of faking it a bit and pretending that was their concerns. We're just sitting around minding our own business. And then I could not believe I saw halal certified Cadbury bars at the Woolworths. When that kind of wasn't really what they were on about. It was more that's how they could put on a facade.
It wasn't so much about racial purity. It was more about culture.
Well, it is about racial purity, but they can't say that. They can't say that, the Jewish bankers are controlling it. It all just sounds a bit odd to regular ears. And since then, they always like to latch on to some mainstream thing and pretend that's their concern. So the next thing was about African crime. Because that's again another kind of Today Tonight issue.
Yeah, and it's highly visible as well.
They'll absolutely take anything if they think it's going to help. Like they just drop Muslims like a hot potato as soon as they could. Like this crime thing started happening. Like I started turning up to their rallies and suddenly they weren't talking about Islam or halal or Muslims at all.
Islam was very 2016.
Yeah. It was and as soon as Trump started talking about the working class and the factories, they jumped onto that. I remember there was like a rally. That was a rally. As soon as Trump started talking about factories closing down the working class, the next rally I turned up to, they just were not talking about Islam at all, like what they've been banging on about.
But they all started wearing toll shirts.
Yeah.
Yes. And then like this yellow vest thing where they just, if there's something overseas that they think they can like make themselves look like they're normal, like we're just normal people with normal concerns.
Even if it comes out of a movement that was born in the left, like they've got the Eureka Stockade, where it's like, this flag means no to the government. It's like, well, it's because
the leadership in those groups are totally serious and really, I guess, politically eccentric.
Yeah.
Like someone like, do I even say their names? Because it kind of, I don't know. But anyway, so just their main leader, for instance.
Yeah.
Like he's really well read about all this far right stuff, and he reads about Hitler and he believes it all and stuff. But he kind of knows it's just weird.
Yeah.
Like he's not going to get a crowd if he starts talking about.
Yeah, he can't drop that one on a fresh audience. Like I've seen that particular leader and. You always see these people lapse into that little conspiracy that they don't really want to show. And I remember seeing. What is it? Is it the Jews fund feminism? That's one thing I've seen. Jewish bankers fund feminism. They don't sound like two things that would go hand in hand, Jewish bankers and feminism, and then this greater communist thing. Have you actually had these conspiracy theories explained to you?
When I go to the meetings.
Yeah, right.
When I go to the international Jewish conspiracy meetings. like hear out. No, they just... That's why kind of conspiracy theories are kind of weird when you're Jewish, because you kind of know in 5 minutes it's going to kind of go, it's all fun and games. There was this bookshop when I was growing up, it's still there, called the Theosophical Bookshop in Melbourne CBD, and it had conspiracy books. And even when I was young, I kind of noticed this thing, you'd start off one end of the shelf and it's like there's aliens, and then you'd kind of move a bit further on and it's the Kennedy assassination and who did the Kennedy assassination. And then it would like ease on more, and it'd be about 9/11 and the Illuminati, and then like you get to the end, it's like David Icke, and it's just the Jews.
Yeah, you kind of when you so do you feel that anxiousness when you're surrounded by conspiracists? It's like it's a matter of time until this laser turns on me right now.
Oh yeah, for sure. I actually feel better. I feel way more comfortable around. Like the far right, because everyone's kind of on your side besides them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But as soon as it's like the left, it just becomes strange. I'll give you like a real solid example of this. Like was after the Christchurch massacre in Auckland, and there's a rally for solidarity and against racism and all that things like that. And this guy just gets to the microphone. So there must be like hundreds of progressive people there who are there because they hate racism and what happened in Christ. And this guy just gets to the microphone and starts talking about the massacre and who was behind it. And we've got to look into the Zionist money that was behind it. And everyone just stands there. It's like how are you meant to take this? You know what I mean? And that just happens all the time.
The Aboriginal community have gotten pretty good at just pulling the mic on when someone starts going on a tangent and
Yeah.
say, "No, we're here about Australia Day, guys. Let's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
talk about Asian property investment and that kind of."
Yeah.
Yeah,
they
yeah.
can kind of keep it on track. But you're right, the lefties, they'll let some dude get up there who'll end up talking about vaccinations and stuff like that. What do you think from the end of the intelligence end?
Yeah.
With that Christchurch thing, and then obviously the Fraser Anning press conference and Egg Boy, and then that beating that kid took, and there was a lot of people on top of him and kicking him that are mentioned in your book.
Yeah, I know.
And this is just someone who's read your book. I was able to identify them. Are the cops aware that are looking into these people? Like, do you reckon, or
Well,
are there files on this movement?
I reckon there would have to be, and this is just my amateur psychological examination. There definitely are like a handful where I would not be surprised if, like, you woke up one morning and, like, one of them was on a watchtower and, you know, had been from different sides as well. Like, you'd sort of hope.
And what percentage do you reckon is like moron follower / excitable dead shit versus
it's really hard to
scary?
pick apart, but definitely like one of like an overgeneralization is the leadership. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're really up to. They know what they're doing, and they're trying to do something. They're not naive at all.
Yeah.
But then amongst the people who turn up, all sorts of people turn up. I'd be talking to someone in the crowd who turned up to this far right rally run by a neo-Nazi or whatever, and I'd be saying, "Oh, why? What's this for you?" And she's going, "Oh, yeah, there's a lot of ICE in our community." And no one's really doing anything about the ICE in our community. It's really great how these guys have spoken to us about how they're sort of going to help get ICE out of the community. And it's like, so clearly they've told her this like totally different story than they've told everyone else. And amongst the people who rock up to the rallies, there's I wouldn't necessarily think, they're all like SS officers or anything.
No, well, like there was an issue that I think it was ASIO or the DSD were having a couple of years back, where their actual spies or employees were putting that they worked at these organisations onto Facebook, to LinkedIn, and they were like, first rule about being a spy: don't tell anyone you're a spy. So
put it on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I guess there are idiots on both sides.
Idiots in the intel. That is another comment they made during after Christchurch, was that it. People were questioning, and obviously Australia hasn't received much flack considering that was a Australian-born product. But ASIO was saying sometimes it's hard to identify these kind of ideologies online because of where like public debate's gotten with the major parties.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes there's elements of supremacy and almost Nazism in like public debate. And therefore, it's harder to identify someone who's actually scary online. Would you believe that?
Well, alongside that, they also they really develop their own language where you just have to be reading it and like pick up on irony and like they'll almost like say the opposite of what they mean, and you have to be like I was doing when I was researching this book, like spending hours a day, and where you'd start going, okay, so when they say crabs, they mean Jews.
Oh, right.
that kind of thing. No, but they also just say things like there'll be a rant about how much they abhor racism.
Yeah.
And it's like the opposite. And so, like, how do you pick that apart if you're,
And these people get to vote.
Yeah.
There's one thing, though, John, I would like to try and wrap my head around is the race around the world. It's probably one of the first times that the people in this country got to see you.
Yes.
And the one thing that's really got me confused is the ABC greenlighting a program that sends people all over the world, as opposed to what it is now, which is, a bit of a toothless tiger that doesn't have enough money to buy a sausage roll for lunch.
It was one of those great moments, and you probably get it in your careers too, where things are going slightly under the radar, like everything hasn't been worked out yet, and then everything kind of fits into place because no one's overthinking it.
Yeah.
And there was so little overthinking of that. That was when I did it. I think it'd run in France or Canada or something, the show already, but they just sent us overseas. It was quite I don't mean disorganised like. Like they didn't
organised chaos.
The spreadsheets or whatever. They didn't really know what we were doing, and we didn't really know what we were doing. And it was also the first, for instance, the first generation of cameras that was small enough that you can have a flip screen and hold it up. So even like that was weird. Like when people are watching on TV, it's just, what's this badly lit video diaries, in so much as they'd even thought about that expression, video diary. So it was just kind of mad and making it up as we're going along, and it was, it kind of fell into place.
So the ABC just gave you a credit card and was like, all right, we need you to go around the world. We need you to, go and do these things, and then you've got to send the video back to us.
Yeah, every 10 days with little notes and stuff.
Every 10 days for 100 days, is that right?
I think maybe for 8. I think we had like 8 stories maybe.
Really? God.
Yes.
But even still, that's a lot of work.
I really learned how to. This is how slack I am. I'm so hard working with my slackness. Is that I just hated doing paper edits because we have to sit there and write notes, time code everything. Yeah. So I was like, how much of this story can I shoot like in one take? And I started like working backwards. Yeah, I started working backwards from that.
Now you kind of then pivoted into. The ABC commissioned another pilot of yours, or a pilot of yours after that. Now iconic skit where you were in a melee with Ray Martin out front of his house, raiding his bins, a current affair style.
Yes.
Still at this point, you weren't overly political, were you? Or
no, I guess. I guess political, like in your own way. I already realised, even from that Ray Martin thing, I could tell I wasn't going to get away with whining.
Yeah.
Because. Or like that, even if I wanted to. Not that I particularly wanted to, but there were things when I was, like Ray Martin was attacking me, where I was like, well, don't do this. Yeah. I was like, I've got a right to be here. And already like watching it, like suddenly you're on Ray Martin's side and not mine. So a lot of the stuff I do is like working backwards from what people put up with.
Yeah.
Which is kind of fair enough. Like I guess it is good to have that thing where it's like, people are only going to put up with you if you're kind of do funny stuff and it's not too whiny. Yeah, so I don't get away with like doing Mike Moore type stuff. Like even I remember on Race Around the World, one thing being a bit of a ideologue kind of fitted into place. It was when I was at Disneyland, and I did have this like quote at the end, like something about the corporations. And already when they cut back to the studio, it's like the judges were like paying out on me, like someone's going against the corporation.
Big business.
So I guess it depends what you mean by political or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was you go from skits to now you're actually at neo-Nazi rallies and spending months with these guys and so on. I guess you're now working in more long-form kind of storytelling.
And a lot of that is just because that's where the work is.
Yeah.
So Penguin, for whatever reason, want me to write books. And I'm like, yeah, cool. Mm-hmm. And then people are like, oh, why don't you do this or that? And I'm like, well, Penguin are asking me to write books. The end.
Now, one thing we noticed in your most recent book about the extremism, how you were seeing flack coming from the left for one particular one, and it was a great little paragraph there, but it was as you were at this rally and documenting yourself at these neo-Nazi rallies, you were being criticised on Twitter by people who only exist on Twitter for dominating a conversation that you're not meant to have.
Yeah.
And your response was interesting in that these people must have short memories if they can't understand why a Jewish guy would be interested in attending a neo-Nazi rally to see what's going on in 2016.
Oh, yeah. I reckon if I could write the book again, the thing I'd put more detail in would be about this whole weird, like, incoherence between, like, wokeness and sort of like the history of the Jews. Like it was because I was baffled at the time because I'm like an old man, and when I went to university, it would have been considered in bad taste to tell a Jew that he shouldn't be on the street protesting Nazis. But it was totally baffling to me. Like I was on the street there. It was like my first day of doing research for this book, and this kind of little Twitter storm started about how like, well, white people like me shouldn't be taking up space in this conversation. Like, I'm like, I just couldn't get my head around it because I was like, and then I did like a little bit of a joke in the book where kind of just talking about what do I end up saying in the book? Yeah, about how maybe you're young and you just pick up kind of history from BuzzFeed or whatever.
Yeah, no, that was the one.
And it goes, well, like, then maybe BuzzFeed should write an article about why a Jew would be at a rally like this. Hey, I've even got a headline for it, Schindler's Listicle. And I wish I'd kind of interrogated that more in the book, but I was too confused when I was in the book.
Yeah. Well, on that issue with Twitter kind of being, its own horrible organism, are you familiar with, the concept of having a person get cancelled?
Yeah, like deplatformed and stuff, yeah.
Do you think you are uncancelable?
No, definitely not. I reckon, people already, I reckon.
Oh, no, not so much deplatformed in that, like has since happened to a lot of these Nazis, as in culturally cancelled. Because I guess the tone was set with the Me Too movement, where it's like, well, we don't talk about them, we don't talk about their art or their work anymore. But now it's not even in relation to that movement, or it's actually, in relation to any slight of gaffe or any kind of incident. Chris Illy's since been cancelled for, obviously a lot of the stuff he did later in his career.
Yeah, I reckon that there's kind of like a thing where if you don't engage with it, you kind of keep on walking on.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's slightly overhammed by both sides. Like, for instance, and also I question the metric of, like, something happens on Twitter and therefore that's what's happening. So, like, just say Dave Chappelle or whatever. So he does a special on Netflix. And then in the reality of Twitter, like, it's, oh, my God, Dave Chappelle's, like, he's over. And, how can he say it or whatever? But clearly he's like going gangbusters ratings-wise for Netflix. So it's like, it's hard for me to like work out the metric.
Yeah.
So Dave Chappelle's probably kind of overhamming it by saying that, he's got to be really careful, or he's going to be... Yeah. But then the other side's also kind of overhamming how much kind of, how important their kind of...
Yeah, so they and comedians are doing that a lot, particularly of that generation. They are saying like, "Oh, I've got to be careful. You can't say anything these days," but you literally are saying much more than you used to. And
So
and nothing's really happening to you.
I kind of guess there will be like a slight recalibration at some point, where
an etiquette kind of develops. Yeah,
but I think like Netflix seems to just casually have it right, where they have like total woke stuff on there, and then they have Dave Chappelle and Bill Burr, and then it's like, so that seems fine. It just seems... I'm kind of like assuming it's going to have to work itself out at some point.
Yeah.
Well, do you ever go through and read the comments? Do you go through and, like, say, for example, you release a book next week, go back through, do you read the comments about it, or do you just keep trucking forward?
I did when... The problem was, or the thing is, often it's really good for me to read the comments, because then I can build shtick off them. So I don't really read the comments for, like, to self-flagellate. But, yeah, like, for instance, like the start of my last book worked much better because I read the comments and some dude saying, "What's this white guy doing here?" And then I that almost, like, triggered the entire book.
Yeah.
And so, it's kind of good for that reason, but it can just...
It can be therapeutic, but it also can be quite unproductive.
And you also, like, lose the plot a bit. Like, you start thinking, not so much with the comments, but for instance, I'll be having some, like, bitter fight with someone in my life, and I'll be thinking, like, and not even like a member of the public, like someone maybe in your extended family or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm like writing my book going, oh, he's going to read this and he's going to... And then you just realise you just spent like 6 months writing this book with that one person in your mind. And it's like, why? Why did I do that? Maybe I should have written it for like the people who like me and stuff.
Yeah.
So my thing about reading comments, it would be, I'd do it if I thought it was helpful for shtick. But as soon as you definitely start losing the plot when you start spending too much time online. I almost have anecdotal proof of that, because I started muting all the people from my last book because I'm moving on to my next project, and I just kind of didn't want in my head and all these political things or whatever. And I started just falling down other rabbit holes. Like for instance, the one new thing I'm working on is about the future of smoking and vaping and everything. So I've started following all those accounts instead. And then like that all fills your head. And then when you're like walking down the street, you think that's the world.
Yeah.
And
it is a hyperactive community, isn't it? The vaping. And
but like suddenly overnight, my head's just not filled with, oh my God, there's all these far right people and far left people and stuff. And if I fall down a rabbit hole of, like I fell down this rabbit hole on YouTube of people doing their homemade guitars or something like that.
Yeah.
And then that suddenly fills your head. You're kind of walking down the street going, and it's like, oh, this is what everyone's thinking about now.
Yeah.
Homemade guitars.
Yeah, look at those humbuckers over there.
It's an interesting skill you have, though, where you can report on these things without trying to sound like a martyr or a patron saint of, you know.
Yeah.
And in fact, in this book, this extremist book, depends what you mean by extremist, you actually do quite an interesting job at humanising people that would be quite clearly villains in a Martin Scorsese film, you know what I mean? Or in the mainstream would consider them probably not the good guys. And you did the hard yards drinking with them in Bendigo or whichever rally they're in, and you kind of applied a personality to them, which is interesting. Was that a hard part of the book, or does that come easy to you? Because it sounds like some of those piss-ups were really a slog.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the far right is that they don't get any more interesting the longer you spend with them. Yeah. So it's almost like the first meeting's great because it's like it's so colourful and you're like it's stimulation overload. It's like, oh my God, he's got a swastika on his neck. Oh my God, I'm hanging out with whatever. then that like the novelty really wears thin, and then like your problem by your third meeting isn't that they're like neo-Nazis, it's that they're just like boring you to tears, you know.
Yeah.
So and like so their political stuff is just so boring after a while, pretty quickly.
So, did you ever get to the bottom of what these people do, like for a living? I mean, there's not too many jobs that would have you if you were covered, in Nazi ink, up and down your neck, on your hands.
Well, some of them are self-employed and just kind of dodge around that, but I think some would just be getting social security and
Is there any elements of organised crime still, or is it more
I wish, because that would have been great for the book.
It didn't actually appear too much. There was no kind of Sons of Anarchy, drop-offs and funding the movement. This is England type shit.
Yeah, I'm trying. I actually asked a guy who works in counter-terrorism recently about is there a connection between the illicit cigarette trade and like these far-right groups or any radical groups, and he said, what did he say? He said there was a raid at I think at Lakemba or Bankstown where counter-terrorism got on to the illicit cigarette trade, but then I think they kind of found out that it was just kind of incidental, so it kind of wasn't funding terrorism. It was just funding cheap Winnie Blues.
Funding small business owners.
Yeah.
So how were you able to convince the SBS and the ABC to fund the things that you did, in the 2000s, from your show Versus God to race relations, which I think was in America first? We've got a lot of the things that a lot of people of our age would know you about, is doing these really, really hectic things. There's obviously that thing with you and your cameraman in the Middle East, how you swapped over your sperm samples. That's always, that's always a story that's told every time your name comes up. Was the ABC and the SBS like, this is great, keep going?
I think I kind of got wind of the fact that they were most obsessed with local politics. So in that you could really get in trouble if you were talking about like the Labor Party too much or the Liberal Party. Like that's what their main concern was. And I kind of wasn't particularly my jam.
Yeah.
So I just sort of started doing kind of like I guess smart thing, and trying to go into areas where they just didn't think about it that much. So and for a while, they were the areas or whatever. But you'd occasionally stumble into things, like you'd learn things, like because I'd always just be taking the mickey out of everything, and then you'd find out that because I did this one thing on Versus God about how like people in lefty suburbs, they sometimes have this plaque out saying, we acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the owners of this or whatever. Yep. So I did like a skit where like I got some Aboriginal dudes, actors to come and sort of like, door knock and like wanting to take their land back from these sort of like from these hippies or whatever. And that was like and I just like wrote that, and I just thought like I've written stuff where you're like taking the mickey out of this and that and Muslims and Jews and Asian or whatever. And I thought this was just another thing, and it was like no, it's like people were just really
that's interesting.
Like where it was like the wardrobe woman was like, I cannot do the clothes for this because you should get an Aboriginal person to do it, and then and it was just all this stuff, and so I just learnt that there were things
hypersensitivity you didn't expect. Now you've also got, and before we go, there's a little bit more supernatural. You're going? I went over to Vanuatu and America to look into the occult for an Audible podcast that will be coming out mid-November. Right.
So modern day.
Is this Polynesian religion or?
Yeah, well, modern day, the two cases, the one I look at in an island on Vanuatu was about these two guys 10 years ago who were, the school principal had died on the island, and these two guys were fingered as practicing witchcraft that had killed the principal. So they have this little island court, and the two guys were like sentenced to death basically, and they were killed. Right, so you can get like the capital punishment really for being a witch these days, And then the other one I looked at was, you might have heard Donald Trump's always banging on about this El Salvadorian gang called MS-13.
Yeah.
And so I was just reading this article where two members killed this girl, and they were claiming, both the police were claiming and the guys in court were claiming that they killed her because she bumped their satanic shrine at their apartment. Right. And I was like, what the hell? And they took her out and they shot her. And then I started reading more about MS-13, and there was like another story where the backstory was it was a demonic killing. And then I started reading more about how there's this one version of their history where the original members were like Satanists, like back in the 1980s. So I went over there to check whether the veracity of that.
El Salvador.
No, I went to Houston, Texas. Yeah. That's where the murder was, one of the satanic murders. And it was only like last year or something, the murder. And then I went to LA where I found these other ex-members of the gang just to kind of check out whether it's true that they've got satanic roots and stuff.
Yeah. Now, you don't seem to have an issue with like being around anyone. Like if you'd asked me who the scariest gang in the world was, I'd probably say MS-13. Have you ever been stumped? Have you ever found any community a bit standoffish?
Who's the scariest person you've ever been next to?
I usually when I get scared, I've got scared for the wrong reason. Yeah. So one time when I was getting crucified in the Philippines, what happened was I got it was part of a ritual that happens anyway. So I wasn't like doing anything unusual. I was just partaking in this ritual, and it was like the real early days of like Blackberries buzzing in your pocket where your name came up. So I think it was like the very next day, or like it wasn't long after I'd been crucified, that there was a buzz in my pocket. I think the Australian was like reporting on it because they'd seen some Associated Press photo or whatever. Yeah. And I started freaking out that like we're going to get in trouble on the island for that. So I was like, we have to get out of here. Like we're just going to get in such big trouble or whatever. And we'd sort of planned to have a meal with the people and the organisers, and we kind of darted off the island because I freaked out. I thought we'd just get in too much big trouble.
This is with the hyper-Orthodox kind of Filipino Christian.
Yeah, Catholics, yeah. And because I just took part in it like in a regular way, in a respectful way, in so much as, but the way they were talking about in the article, it was like all like prankster clown, and I was just like, like if they read that, maybe we're going to get throttled. Yeah. So I got really scared and convinced the crew that we have to leave, and then we sort of got in more trouble because it was like so obnoxious and rude to kind of leave before having the meal and stuff.
And none of them had their iPhones.
No, exactly. Good point.
Well, we wish you the best with the next book, and thanks for joining us, Mr. Safran,
thank you very
Detective.
much. No, thank you.